to be working on this kind of a problem. Now there's some difficulties with this, which I barely touched on. I've discussed a few of the difficulties of making the analysis. There's some other difficulties. For example, the procurement of some of these new systems or new solutions to old problems is a very heavily politically motivated phenomenon. And I'm not saying politically in the sense of Republican versus Democrat. When I use the term, unless I qualify it otherwise, I mean really a part of the natural political process, no matter who happens to be running it. But these are what used to be considered pork barrel type funds. It's the kind of funds where a locality profits from it in many cases. And therefore the local congressmen have a very great interest in seeing to it as their locality as opposed to some other. So here you find a complete analysis, go back to this transportation. I run complete analyses on the top 100 pairs of cities in the U.S. I run complete analyses on the 19 or 20 metropolitan cities that are growing together. These look like very attractive markets for this kind of surface transportation. And yet you ask yourself, well, which one is going to get it? It is partially a question of which one needs it worse, but it's partially a question of which one has the most powerful congressman. And this is hard for a company like us to sort through. There are other political aspects, like a locality building, let's say, a high-speed train system, would prefer to have that train built by one of their local industries. So we might find ourselves forced to set up subsidiaries or plants in areas that don't really make sense from other standpoints just for that. Another problem is the fact that the customer at the moment is very splintered. Now, many people hesitate to deal with the government because as a customer, even in the military business, the customer is splintered there. But he's nowhere near as splintered there as he is in the Great Society business. You can at least find the organization in the Defense Department that does procure weapons. They may have a little trouble finding him, but he's there and he's got the job, and you can, when you find him, you'll admit he has the job, and he'll tell you if you win this contract, he will sign it. Well, it's much more difficult in the case of some of these other agencies. Take, for example, the Northeast Corridor. In order to run a train from Boston to Washington, you would go through approximately 140 separate, totally independent contracting agencies under the present arrangement. Right? Who's the customer for that train? All 140 of them? Some brand new, as yet undefined super authority that ties them together? And people have tried that, by the way, so far unsuccessfully. Or do you take the easy way out and make it an airplane, which doesn't have to pay allegiance to each of these 140 and only worries about a few of them along the way, where they have to stop or get radio signals or something like that? Well, this is one of the problems that I find hard to sort out. These customers are very inexperienced, too. Many of these agencies have never bought anything the least bit sophisticated. They'll buy toilet paper, light bulbs. Occasionally they'll subcontract a building to an architect engineering company, and that's absolutely the kind of only limits they've ever faced. And if I bring into them a specification, which might be 2 inches thick, which is the kind of thing they ought to be sending me, telling me what to build for them, but I could write it and have. If I take that into them, they don't understand the technical facts. They don't understand the contractual relationships I'm proposing. And it's just a brand new world. So we in the aerospace industry find ourselves trying to educate municipalities, states, and others as to what the practices that have been common in the military procurement are.
Yeah. One thought that comes to mind, Harry, is the possibility that we have an analogy here between, as represented by your relations of other persons similarly situated to you, the government, to the ground-up organization, bottom-up organization that you're describing at Boeing. Lots of the ideas are coming from private sector.
Right.
Private sector sees the possibility of profitable economic activity because of programs the government is pushing. So the private sector comes and proffers ideas. Now, the instruments the government has set up to cope with these problems, as you say, are diffuse, often incompetent, lacking the talent, resources, skills that you have available, so that it looks like we're developing an adjunct to government, a technical adjunct to government, consisting of persons like yourself and your company, which are influencing the decisions which will be made in a significant way. I think some of the data that you have generated, and I believe some of the experiences you have told me about the last couple of days, wherein, because of ideas, solutions, suggestions you have brought to various agencies, they have come back to you and set up a dialogue with interchange of information and interchange of techniques, which will influence in some significant way the decisions which will ultimately be made in some of these areas. I think that interchange is of extreme importance, and I should think would do the country one hell of a lot of good. I'm interested in your company.
Well, we in the aerospace industry have developed with the procurement agencies, the Department of Defense and their sub-departments, a rapport over the years, which is a pretty well-balanced one. They have tremendous capability collectively. They have non-profit institutions where they don't have it themselves. They'll buy one or set one up and create it. So we're dealing with a very sophisticated customer. But even a sophisticated customer knows that this interchange you talk about is extremely valuable. But as I said in my case of the president having a staff, we can't put a staff together in our company that's got all the smarts in it. Well, neither can the customer. So a good customer always has an open door for a vendor of some sort coming in to try and sell him something new. If the guy comes in with a bunch of idiocy the third time about, he doesn't get through the door. But if he's got rational ideas or new ideas, or has a pretty good batting average even on them, he's welcome with open arms. And we find that true with our subcontractors too. We couldn't get along without them. They're 80% of our work in some programs. So a sophisticated customer appreciates this. But he can also evaluate these ideas. He has the ability, the technical and the managerial and the contractual ability to evaluate a suggestion. And in many cases, he turns it around 90 degrees from what we said and says, well, this is really more suitable. And we say, well, sure, you're right. It is better. Or we'll come in with a technical idea, and they'll say, well, you didn't even know it, but so-and-so over here is already working on that. So you go see so-and-so, and he says, Jesus, he's 10 years past me. Why should I fool with that anymore? You've got a damn sophisticated customer. And this sophistication is absent, by and large, in this great society field. The customers are not very sophisticated. Now, they are in
That's not true of the Defense Department.
No, I'm saying in the Defense Department they are sophisticated, but you look at where do you go to sell a high-speed surface transportation system for the Northeast corner. You go to the Department of Commerce. And they have some sophisticated people that they just brought in there. But they aren't going to be the ones buying it, really. They're the ones that are buying ideas, demonstrations, studies. But when it comes to buying the train, or whatever it turns out to be, which is the only reason we're interested in it in the first place, they're probably not the one that's going to buy it because of this 140 different organizations that have to decide what they buy. It's some other organization. We don't know what, including the Department of Commerce doesn't know what. Maybe this Department of Transportation will.
Well, you're assuming that this will be a publicly operated system.
Not necessarily. Whether it's public, it's going to be publicly regulated, whether it's publicly operated or not.
The purchaser may be a private entity.
But if it is, that same 140 different organizations still have to accept his proposition. And they all have different ideas of what it ought to be. Because these are the regulatory agencies, as well as in some cases being the procurement agencies. You take a port authority, for example. It, by its very charter, is a government property-owning, property-managing type of function. If you decide to run a terminal into the Port of New York, or the City of New York, it has to be, by law, a Port Authority terminal, as I understand it. Any new ones, at least. If not, then you have a problem of getting the agreement of the City of New York to change or to vary their regulations accordingly. And you repeat this 140 times, you get very frustrated. In fact, I am. I can't figure out how to get around this one. Oh, I can see some forces at work. The Department of Transportation may very well, as a U.S. function, because it is interstate transport, decide that it is outside the authority of the states. Well, this might be challenged. It might take 2 to 5 years to get through the courts, but it could well decide this, and probably would be able to make a step. And that's one way out. As I read the federal government's approach, they would rather get the states to step up and form such an authority themselves. Because this has been done between 2 states in some cases, where there's a project that crosses the border of the states. The 2 states will work on it occasionally. And in the Northwest, we have a case where 3 states and a province of called British Columbia got together and made a deal. And it was legal and it worked, and everybody's happy. But these are rare, I'm afraid, today.
Well, I had in mind this sort of thing, Harry, that let's say that which railroad would be the New Haven would operate a train, or New Haven is absorbed by the Tennessee Combine, will operate a train, say ultimately between Boston and Washington. That is the entity which will purchase the train. Now, 140 agencies may have a hand in specifying the requirements for that system, both in its surface aspect, that is, in its non-mobile aspect and mobile aspect. But when the sale actually transpires, all that is background, and there is a vehicle of yay dimensions and yay characteristics which will be made and sold.
Well, you reflect exactly the guidance that my corporate counsel keeps trying to give me. That is, find the commercial customer that's going to be the market and sell him. And yet when you try to do this, in this particular case, you find all sorts of fascinating things.
Have you talked to them? Have you gone to
I've talked to the Pennsylvania case. I haven't bothered with New Haven.
I understand. Nobody comes to New Haven anymore.
But
what does the Pennsy say?
The Pennsy says 2 interesting things. One, they don't understand a word I'm saying. In other words, they are a very technically unsophisticated customer. Secondly, they say, well, don't you think probably this line would be run on a different right-of-way anyway? And the answer is yes. There are parts of the Pennsy or New Haven right-of-way that are quite essential to such a program, but there are other parts that are absolutely wrong. So they would have to get an additional right-of-way. They also recognize, as do I, that most of the propositions which make any kind of total sense from a social standpoint do not make sense unless the government buys at least the right-of-way. So that it would be a government-owned right-of-way with a privately owned train and control system, perhaps, for it. This is the least one. This is the only one that is the closest to being private-owned. There are others where it doesn't make sense under any condition, except the social benefits might still warrant the taxes. And so these get to the extremely odd relationships. And
do you find yourself, Harry, in this ground transportation field, being able to get pretty close to the... can you identify the bodies which are likely to be exert the greatest influence on the ultimate decision?
Well, you have to recognize that we're all of us new in this business, in the sense that I could answer your question a lot easier if you were asking about a Department of Defense project. But yes, I can identify a lot of them. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has a urban transportation division, and we know how much money they have. We've examined their budget and they forecast for the budget for the future. We know pretty much where they're planning to spend it by having talked to them. We know, as well as they know, what the interface between them and the Department of Transportation is or going to be, because they don't know yet, really. They know what their plans are, as best anybody knows. We know in the Department of Commerce, we know Dr. Nelson and his group very well, and have even bid on small contracts with him, which we didn't win, but which didn't bother me because I didn't want to win it anyway. I just wanted to stay friends. I've offered, as of yesterday, he was up here incidentally, I offered to do a little more work for him free, so I'll be going back to Washington in a couple of weeks to talk to him again. So those two we know. Now when you get outside of the federal government, you get into a much more difficult state. Take our own local area around Seattle, for example. We have a private group which is desirous of getting a high-speed urban transportation put in. and they're just plain motivated that way for these very social reasons. They hate the hell out of freeways. They think that the right way for Seattle to grow is to have green belts and to have satellite cities outside Seattle with links and so on. They want to preserve a smog-free atmosphere and things like this, and they see all these problems being at least aided by a modern high-speed surface system of significantly shorter range than I'm talking about up until now. So you say, are they a customer? Well, no, they're not a customer, but they're the beginning of one, because they're influencing the mayor of the city, who is not in himself a customer, who in turn is influencing the voters, however, to form a metropolitan district which includes more than the city of Seattle. And the mayors of some of the smaller cities around are becoming convinced this might work. And they in turn are beginning to soften up the public to accept the idea of a bond issue and the formation of this overall metropolitan authority. And it will, I am sure, turn out that that will happen eventually. When it happens, I will be right there if I want to take advantage of it, because I joined this organization to make goddamn sure I knew what they were up to. And I think I know at least who will probably be the head of that authority if it passes. So I'll have some friends and contacts.
I was in your review, was I not?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you recall our discussions of Louvrier? If I have his name correctly, in Paris?
Trying to recall.
Spoke about the assignment he had from de Gaulle, think about the future development of Paris. And
the
satellite
city.
cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Satellite cities around Paris.
I didn't recognize his name, but
well,
I know who you mean.
I may have his name correctly. And then he spoke of their thinking about the transportation between satellite city and Paris.
And they're serious about this.
They are serious about that. Hey, have you followed that up?
Yes,
That's an interesting one, Harry. I mentioned this by the by because there seems to be a connection with your...
Well, in fact, the most fascinating instances of city planning actually exist in Europe. And they exist there for a pretty logical reason, that Europe is more socialized than the United States is. And therefore, you remember our trip to Stockholm. They have a superb transit system there, and they do use this satellite city approach there, and it works. Well, why does it work? It works because Stockholm bought up the land. They own the land, all of it, not just the parts that the rail line runs on, all of it. So when they decide they don't want a city here, they just say there ain't going to be a city here. It's going to stay green, you know. Nobody can argue because it's the city's land. Well, I don't recommend this, but I say it certainly makes it easier for this kind of a development.
Let me ask you this, Harry. The sophistication about government and government operations, about government organization, both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch, should be fairly high if one is going to function effectively on these long-term, complex programs that deal with large social issues. Where did you get your education about government that permits you to knock at the right doors and not at the wrong doors, to discern your way around the system?
Well, I tell you, let me finish a couple more problems on this social type business area, and then I'd like to switch over to how we work in the regular contractual interface we're a lot more familiar with, and maybe that'll answer your question. Where we get the sophistication is because we've been working with the government for 50 years.
I've been working with, I see. But where do you personally get it, sir? I mean, have you gotten it by virtue of your corporate activities?
Of my activities.
The corporation doesn't make an effort to turn you in this. Do you have any educational program within the company that...
No, it's strictly on-the-job training.
And the people who will come after you, who will know the government well, will acquire that knowledge by virtue of interfaces that rise through contracting and...
Well, when it starts and so on. Well, our aerospace group contains about 40,000 employees. I've seen approximately 7,000 are engineers and another 2,000-3,000 are managers of various sorts. Now that 9,000 guys roughly are the ones that do interface regularly with the government. And a junior engineer, from the day he's hired, he starts being indoctrinated automatically by the fact he's working on a government contract. And the piece of work he does, he suddenly discovers after a week or so, he's got to turn out a report. Who's the report to? Well, it's to the customer. Well, who the hell's the customer? And he starts learning it's got to be in this format because that's what the contract says. Well, what contract? Well, you want to read the contract. Okay, you bring him a copy of the contract. He says, my God, it stands like a flip. He said, no, I don't want to read the contract. Where's the section having to do with my job? And then they said, now you're beginning to understand the problem. You have to know what your relation with your part of the customer is, and here it is in this section of the contract. And he'll read that, and he'll say, oh my heavens, I haven't been doing some of those things. Well, yeah, but you're supposed to. So pretty soon he starts doing what's in the contract. Then after a few months or years, depending on the individual, he's asked to go visit the customer, or the customer comes visit him. And as part of their job of monitoring our progress on a program, they ask for verbal meetings as well as written reports. So they'll come in, and the man will be brought into a room about the size of this, and he'll be asked to make a presentation to a panel of 15 or 50 Air Force or civilian members of the government, who will throw a half hour's worth of questions at him when he's through, and then try to evaluate whether he is technically sound in what he's doing. Well, after he's done that a few times, he wonders who were those guys. And they say, well, this guy here is in the laboratory A, and this one's in the management organization B, and would you like a list of them? And he said, yeah, well, where do they fit? Oh, you'd like to know what the organization of the government is, right? Here's a document that stands a foot high that is kept up to date daily on organization of the government.
Who keeps it up to date? The government?
No, we keep it up to date. And it's a very difficult process because the government reorganizes rather rapidly. But as daily if necessary, we will update that document. So he discovers this document. And he said, okay, that guy I met here who was giving me the work time, he's in laboratory A, which works under management organization B, which in turn is part of this organization C. So he said, I'd like to get to know him and why he gives me such a bad time. Oh, you'd like to get to know him? Fine. Here's a set of tickets. Go back and visit him in his laboratory. And take with you some of the answers that you didn't have when he was giving you a bad time. And so he goes back, he introduces himself, and he's welcome, because he now has some answers they're interested in. And they show him around the lab, and they're proud of their activities too. Pretty soon he meets some of the other people, and then gradually you pick it up.
But this kind of experience would largely be DOD, say, in NASA.
DOD and NASA, yeah, so far. But
right.
the fundamentals
of your concerns, and that group that you speak of, that you're head of, is involved with everything from National Science Foundation to God knows what.
Well, the fundamentals do not differ.
Interior, in agriculture, you're spreading across departments, across agencies, the knowledgeability about federal government operations as well as leaning out state and local community. So it's got to be pretty keen and pretty sophisticated. And I should think that all of this would be a natural growth of even the aerospace military kind of thing.
Well, the availability of the knowledge of the facts is not, but the knowledge of the method by which the facts can be attained is. Like when the government decides to reorganize, or more commonly when we as a company decide to go after a contract in some slightly different part of the Department of Defense than we're used to, one must find out how that department is organized. Like for many years we had no Navy business. We worked almost solely on Air Force programs. And no matter what you read in the newspapers, the Navy is organized and has a power structure, a true organization that doesn't show on the chart, substantially different from that of the Air Force. We didn't know any of them. We didn't know their organization except the charts. So one starts out by saying, well, here's a guy whose box is labeled hydrofoil boats. Let's go get acquainted with him. We're interested in hydrofoil boats.
You took the initiative.
Sure. So we have done a little bit of research maybe on a foil for a hydrofoil boat or a control system for one. And we go into that guy's office and say, hey, we don't know our way around in your shop very well, but your job says hydrofoil boats. And we have here a little 20-minute presentation that is about hydrofoil boats. Would you be interested? He said, well, no, not really. He said, my problem is different. I just got reorganized last week. However, the guy that took my job is across the hall down the road, and I'll call him up and introduce you to him. So you go down and find the right guy, and you give him the briefing. If he's interested, if you've done a good job on your briefing, he says, hey, I'd like you to meet some of my subordinates and my superior and give them this briefing. So you do, and you carefully keep a record of who the hell you saw. Then on time later, you either go back and see the subordinates, or you go back and see the superior. Then you start working up the line and get interested in a particular contract. It's a big enough one, to make some big wash in the Navy, let's say. One that might have to be finally decided by the Secretary of the Navy, as opposed to a little tiny study that one of these lower level people can do. So you work your way up the chain of command, and pretty soon you find an office where you can't get in. they don't know who the hell you are. And they maybe got a star on their shoulder instead of an eagle. And you find that they're a little bit conscious of the fact that you're nobody. So then you go back home and you get the boss, your boss, or a vice president, or a president in some cases. And you say, hey boss, I got problems. There's a big contract coming out of this office, and this chain of people have to make the decision as to whether we win or not, and I can't get in to see you. So the boss says, fine. I know the Secretary of the Navy. He and I are on a panel together that has to do with government business interrelations. I'll call him up. So he does. He says, hey, Bannerman, your idiots aren't listening to my time. Now, when the hell are you going to come and let me talk to you and your people about this program? Tomorrow, if you want. All right, we'll be in tomorrow. So we go in with a team of 5 or 6 guys, and there might be 300 people show up for one of those meetings. And you try like mad, and you bring a special man with you to do nothing but take names of who the hell was there, because that starts flushing out who is the group of guys that are really going to make the decision. All right, but the methodology doesn't differ whether I'm working that problem, NASA, Department of Interior, or Agriculture. It's got the same general flavor, just different faces, different capabilities, and different structures. And we even learned how to work with Congress on the same basis. You kind of go in innocently, and you ask a few questions, and you find out that there are ways of working the problem.
I need to speak to, how do you inform yourself, quarter of 3, you said something about a break at 2:30 to do a few things you wanted to do. What did you speak to me? Why don't we do it now? And then,
it won't take me
I'm very happy about it.
Well, she's obviously very tight, and I can see how she's really... There's no warping of the reels.
It probably just needs service. Well, we'll see if it collapses before we get there. Well, I wanted to finish up a couple more problems
Very
having
good.
to do with the social business with the government.
Very good.
Then we can go on wherever you want.
Excuse me, just before we start, when are we moving?
We can't away from it, but we're not committed to things.
Well, that should be plenty, I'm sure. Well, another one of the problems that I'm facing right now is trying to get the customer to recognize that the small tasks that he has right now are not profitable. We can't make any money off these little jobs. A big company has to find a way to work on big jobs, or it just plain doesn't make money. And you can argue that, yes, we should contribute our great strength to help out the nation, but this is, in fact, not practical beyond a certain point. I mean, we put people on committees, we have community chest drives, we collect the government's tax, we collect the money for their bonds and everything else, but there comes a point where if you put your top engineers on a job for the government, you've got to see some pretty significant payoff potential.
When you get to the $4 billion, where would you rank?
Oh, I think it's around 15th or 18th, somewhere around there. I haven't looked at the top 500 recently. Last I looked, General Motors was about 16 billion, and they're going to be less than that this year. And there were 2 or 3 oil companies in the 4 to 10 billion class, and then it drops off fairly fast.
It could be higher than 15.
Might well be, I don't know. Anyway, it is difficult for the customer to understand that I don't know, I can't see it to my benefit, to the company's benefit, to go work on these little contracts for the money. So they find it very difficult, I find it difficult to explain to them that I'd really rather work for nothing on these contracts, not get a contract at all. If there's some way that my people can help them, and at the same time leave me free to decide whether I want to work on that or not, which I cannot do under a contractual arrangement, it's probably more effective from my viewpoint, and certainly ought to be more effective from theirs because it doesn't cost them anything. I said if it is essential that in order to get acquainted with the customer that I take a small contract or compete for one, I'll do that. But by and large, our corporate counsel has told me that they want it to be very rare and under unimpeachable circumstances, which they don't insist on approving before the fact, but which they will look at after the fact, because they don't want me to sneak the company into one of these businesses. And they've had this happen time and again in the military side, where the corporate counsel would decide, we do not wish to bid on such and such a contract, or we do not wish to try and open up the Navy market for the next couple of years for good and sufficient reasons. And then some person would go out and get a study contract, which they could do without approval of a higher level of management, and then would in turn get that beefed up to a larger contract. And before anybody knew it, in the top structure of the company, we were bidding on, or in the middle of being committed to bid on, a major contract which we didn't really want. So this is a real specific set of instructions. We have to be very careful not to take these small contracts. And it's another difference to the Boeing company from other companies. You'll find North American, Lockheed, and several other companies have set up little organizations that are out like running around like mad trying to get these little study contracts in this great society field. The 4 studies run by the state of California with the aerospace companies. One on crime, one on transportation, one on data management, and I forget the 4th was on pollution, I think. Each of those companies lost more money on those contracts than the contracts paid them. The actual loss was in excess of what they were paid. Their management thought it was a pretty good idea at the time, but I understand 2 of the 4 have decided it isn't in the future. And I forget who the other one is. But the point is, you just can't build an organization who can survive and grow on these little study contracts unless you're just superbly lucky. We've seen it happen many times. So the attitude of Boeing is that we will analyze this field for as long as it takes us. We'll spend whatever time it takes under a controlled level of effort in my organization. And every 6 months or a year, they'll review what I'm doing and decide whether they want to continue analyzing the field only, or whether they want to direct me to stop that field and pick a different one out of the list I've given them, or whether I have a good enough story that says, all right, now is the time, this is the area, we will make a major decision as a company to enter this field.
What would your assessment be on that? Do you see anything predictably low of the area on the horizon?
No, I really don't.
Probability?
I really do not see it for the Boeing company at this particular time, and I frankly don't see it for most companies at this particular time. There are some companies who are willing to enter a field at a lower level of effort and with much less of a corporate commitment. Again, I'd use Litton Industries as an example. If they decide to, and I think they have decided to go after this kind of business, they would set up another subsidiary or buy some $2 or $3 million a year sales company, buy or exchange stock for it, and would set it up as a completely independent organization which their corporate staff and their corporate procedures are equipped to monitor. Ours is not equipped to monitor a large number of such activities, but they've designed their corporation more as a holding company than we have designed ours. We consider ourselves an operating company. Textron is definitely a holding company. And there, your management control systems, your corporate evaluation mechanisms, your staffs are all designed to evaluate an independent organization and to keep it independent and to be ruthless with it. If it doesn't make a profit, kill it. Sell it to somebody else. Kill it completely. Well, ours is not designed that way. Our attitude isn't that way. We think of ourselves as an operating company as opposed to a holding company. We think that our management ought to help make things happen as opposed to sit back and decide whether we're going to do it or not and forget it at that point. And we kind of would like to aim more towards a mixture of these two attitudes, where during the decision to go forward with something, we have the same hard-hearted cost-effectiveness evaluation that Textron or Litton would. But after we've decided, we then put the same energy that we do now into making it occur correctly and efficiently and effectively. If we could get this schizophrenic attitude, we think we've got a better arrangement.
Litton, then, you think makes a very tough assessment, but once having made that assessment, it has to be pretty casual in operation.
Well, I really shouldn't use a company's name here because I don't know Litton that well, but I do know Textron a little better, and I know a couple other companies that have this attitude. They're not casual. They have monthly or, if necessary, weekly financial reviews of the activity. But in terms of helping that organization, they don't. They say, you are on your own. If you don't produce X number of dollars of cash flow as opposed to Y number of dollars of investment, we kill you. You're fired as a boss. Your people are transferred to other organizations or are fired. And we're through with that organization. We've got no more time for it. And you can organize a rather small, hard-hitting, financially oriented type staff for corporate headquarters that can run that kind of an organization and make good money at it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's another contribution to American life. But it isn't the way we see ourselves. Now, this point leads me to next to the last of the problem areas. In order for me to provide a convincing argument to the corporate counsel that we ought to get into one of these businesses when I have one, when I think I have one, I must do a very exhaustive business analysis. In other words, I have to essentially lay out the course of this business for about 10 years ahead, with inaccuracy, but with a great deal of care, nevertheless, including decision points along the way where management can reevaluate it, including the resources I'll need, not only money, but facilities and key individuals, including where physically I should locate it and what kind of a problem that makes us. And in fact, the book alone that lists the kind of things that I think I have to give, and they've never been very specific about this, but they've given me a couple examples of previous studies, is about 2 inches thick. This is just blank pages, with the charts outlined on them and no data. and it seems to be relatively independent of whether it was transportation or any other field. I'd have to have about the same data. And it starts with market forecasts, which obviously they want. It starts with, it contains conceptual ideas and what kind of products we'd have to provide and what the price would be of those products and therefore how long it would take us to break even at a certain sales price, what the sensitivity of the market is to price, and dozens of things like that. And it's very painful, but I think it's sensible. The only problem that I have, and I can't completely decide whether it's going to work, is whether you could ever get that much data without at least getting your feet slightly wet. You might have to actually get in the business for a year at maybe a $500,000 investment, something real small. But with the commitment that's the next year is to provide that data and take little